Open my safe, and I'll wire you $100 million right now, Richard Halvorson said, his voice smooth, amused, like he'd just tossed a coin into the air for entertainment. And the room followed his lead instantly, laughter spilling across polished marble floors and echoing against floor-to-ceiling glass as champagne flutes caught the chandelier light, turning everything gold and distant and untouchable, while at the far edge of the room, barely inside the circle of importance, Zariah Cole stood still with a folded cloth in her hand, the faint scent of lemon cleaner clinging to her skin, her reflection faint in the black mirror of the safe's steel door, a reflection no one else seemed to notice, because no one was looking at her, not really, just through her, like she was part of the furniture, part of the quiet system that kept everything shining without ever being seen. And yet her eyes didn't move away from the safe, not when someone joked about guessing the code, not when another voice called it unbreakable, not even when Richard stepped closer to it, tapping the metal twice with his knuckles like it was a pet he'd trained. Biometric layers, adaptive encryption, real-time pattern shift, he added casually, as if listing off features of a luxury car. Nobody opens it unless I want them to. And again the laughter came, louder this time, confident, certain, because in this room, certainty was currency, and Richard owned most of it. But Zariah's grip tightened slightly around the cloth, not out of nerves, but focus, because she wasn't hearing what they were hearing, she wasn't seeing what they were seeing. She was watching the delay between his words and the soft hum behind the steel, the subtle lag when he tapped it, the way the system responded just a fraction too late, like it was thinking, adjusting, learning, and that was when something shifted inside her, quiet but undeniable. The kind of shift that doesn't ask permission. It's not impossible, she said, her voice calm, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the laughter like a thin blade. And just like that, the room changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that a few heads turned, enough that the laughter didn't land the same way, enough that Richard paused mid-smile and looked at her fully for the first time, not as background, but as interruption, his eyes narrowing slightly, curious, amused, maybe even a little annoyed. You think you can open it? He asked, tilting his head just enough to make it feel like a challenge dressed as a joke, and a few people chuckled again, softer now, watching, waiting, because something about the moment had shifted from entertainment to test. And Zariah didn't rush her answer, didn't step back, didn't shrink under the weight of the room or the weight of him. She simply set the cloth down on the nearest table, the fabric making a soft sound against polished glass, and stepped forward, one measured step at a time, until she stood in front of the safe, close enough to feel the cool air coming off the metal, close enough to see her reflection sharpen. A young black woman in a borrowed uniform standing in a room that had never been built for her. And yet she didn't look out of place, not in that moment, not with the way her eyes traced the edges of the keypad, the seams of the door, the tiny imperfections hidden beneath layers of precision. Just one try, she said quietly, and someone behind her let out a small laugh. This should be good. But Richard didn't laugh this time, not fully, because something in her tone didn't match the game he thought he was playing, something steady, something certain, and he gestured toward the safe with an open hand. Go ahead, he said, his voice lighter than his eyes. But understand something, he added, stepping just a little closer, his shadow stretching beside hers across the polished floor. This isn't a toy. And if you fail, you don't just walk away like nothing happened. The room leaned in, the air tightening, the hum of the building suddenly louder in the silence between words. And Zariah didn't look at him when she answered, her attention already on the metal, on the rhythm, on the system beneath the surface. I'm not guessing, she said softly, and then she reached out, her fingertips brushing the cold steel, her ear tilting closer, listening, not for numbers, but for something deeper, something hidden in the space between signals. And in that moment, the room didn't laugh, didn't speak, didn't move, because without realizing it, they had all stopped watching a joke and started witnessing something they couldn't yet explain, something that hadn't finished unfolding yet. The metal felt colder the longer her fingers stayed on it, like it was pulling heat away, testing her patience the same way the room was. But Zariah did not rush. She leaned in just enough for her ear to catch the faint mechanical whisper beneath the surface, not a sound most people would notice, not over the low hum of expensive air conditioning and the quiet clink of glass behind her, but it was there, a pattern buried inside a system designed to hide patterns, and she closed her eyes for a second, letting everything else fall away, the laughter that had faded, the eyes on her back, the weight of Richard Halvorson standing just a few feet away watching her like a man waiting for a trick to fail. Because that was what this was supposed to be, a trick, a moment of entertainment before the night moved on. But the longer she stood there, the less it felt like a game, and the more it felt like something unfinished, something left open by someone who believed no one else would ever notice. Her hand moved slowly to the dial, not turning it yet, just resting there, feeling the micro-vibration, the slight delay in response that should not exist in a system this expensive, this precise, and behind her someone whispered, "She is stalling," but another voice answered quietly, "No, she is thinking." And that difference, small as it was, shifted the room again. Richard heard it too, his expression tightening just slightly, not anger, not yet, but something closer to interest. Because people in his world did not pause like this, they guessed, they performed, they failed quickly so the room could move on. But she was not performing. She was studying him through what he had built, and that was what unsettled him. "You will not find anything there," he said, his voice controlled, measured. But Zariah did not respond. She adjusted her stance, pressed her ear closer, and this time she heard it clearly. Not a code, not a sequence, but a response loop, the system recalibrating every time it detected input, learning, adapting, but still tied to an origin, a baseline. And that baseline was not random. It was human. Her fingers finally moved, turning the dial slightly, then stopping, not because she was unsure, but because she was confirming something, listening for the echo, the return signal, the delay that matched the rhythm she had noticed earlier. A rhythm that was not mechanical at all. It was uneven, almost like a heartbeat that had been translated into code. And that was when her eyes opened again, not wide, not surprised, just certain, and behind her the room had gone completely still now. No more whispers, no more quiet jokes, just attention, focused and heavy. Because something about the way she moved no longer looked like guessing. It looked like understanding. And Richard felt it before he admitted it. The subtle shift in control. The way the room was no longer anchored to him alone. And he stepped closer without realizing it, drawn in by something he could not yet name. "What do you think you hear?" he asked, softer now. Not mocking, not dismissive. But Zariah still did not look at him, her hand turning the dial again, slower this time, aligning with the pattern she had mapped in her mind, her voice finally breaking the silence, quiet and steady. "It is not changing as much as you think," she said, and a flicker passed across his face, brief but real, because that was not something anyone had said before, not anyone who had stood where she was standing, and for the first time that night, the certainty in the room did not belong entirely to him anymore. Her fingers did not move faster. They moved with intention, each slight turn of the dial followed by a pause that felt longer than it was, as if she was waiting for something invisible to answer back. And in a way, it was, the system responding in micro-delays, subtle shifts that only existed if someone was patient enough to notice them. And Zariah was, because she had learned patience in places where rushing meant failure, where listening meant survival, and that instinct now settled into her hands, steady and grounded, while behind her the room held its breath. The earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that forms when people realize they might be watching something real, not staged, not predictable. And Richard stood closer now, close enough to see the precision in her movements, the way she was not guessing combinations but tracing logic. And that unsettled him more than he expected, because this safe was not built to be read. It was built to adapt, to shift, to outthink whoever tried to break it. And yet she was not trying to outthink it. She was aligning with it. And that difference was what made his jaw tighten just slightly. "You are assuming it has a pattern," he said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer amused. And Zariah's hand paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing, her eyes fixed on the dial, her voice calm. "Everything built by a person has a pattern," she replied. And that answer did not land like a challenge. It landed like a fact, simple and grounded. And something in the room shifted again, because it was no longer about whether she could open the safe. It was about whether she was right about him, about the idea that even something designed to be unpredictable still carried the imprint of its creator, and Richard felt that thought press against him in a way he did not expect, subtle but present, like a mirror he had not agreed to look into. And Zariah turned the dial again, slower now, matching the rhythm she had mapped in her mind, not perfectly even, not mechanical, but human, slightly irregular, with pauses that felt like hesitation, like memory, like something that had once been felt rather than calculated. And then she stopped, her fingers resting lightly against the metal, her head tilting just enough to listen one more time, confirming what she already knew, and the room leaned forward without moving, drawn into that stillness, into that final moment before something either worked or did not. And Richard did not speak again, because for the first time that night, he was not sure what would happen next, and that uncertainty, small but undeniable, settled into his chest as she took a slow breath and adjusted the dial one last time. The motion precise, deliberate, final, and then there was a sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a clean, unmistakable click that cut through the silence like a line drawn across it. And for a second nothing else happened. No one moved, no one spoke, as if the room needed time to understand what it had just heard. And then the door of the safe shifted, barely at first, then slowly opening on its own weight, revealing the darkness inside. And Zariah did not step back, did not react the way the room did. With sharp inhales and stunned expressions, she simply looked inside, her gaze steady, and what she saw did not match the expectation that had filled the room just moments before. No stacks of cash, no gleaming bars of gold, just a single object resting in the center, quiet and out of place. And something in her expression changed, not shock, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that comes when a puzzle reveals more than it was supposed to. And behind her, Richard's voice came again, softer than before, almost careful. What is in there? And this time, Zariah turned slightly, just enough for her voice to reach him, calm and certain. Not what you told them, she said, and the silence that followed felt different, deeper, because whatever had just opened was no longer just a safe. No one moved at first, as if the room itself was unsure whether to believe what had just happened. The open safe sitting there like a quiet contradiction to everything that had been said only moments ago, and Zariah's gaze remained fixed inside, steady and focused, while the people behind her shifted uncomfortably, their confidence slipping into curiosity, into doubt, into something they could not quite name. And Richard stepped forward slowly, not with the same effortless control he had carried before, but with something more measured, more careful, his eyes narrowing as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew should have been there. Step aside, he said, not harsh, but firm, and Zariah did, without resistance, taking a small step back, her hands lowering to her sides, the faint scent of cleaning solution still clinging to her skin as if reminding everyone exactly who she was supposed to be in that room. And yet no one saw her that way anymore. Not after what she had just done, not after the way she had stood there and listened to something no one else even knew existed. And Richard leaned in, his shadow falling across the open safe, his eyes locking onto the object inside. And for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in his expression, subtle, but undeniable. The kind of change that does not belong in a room like this, a flicker of recognition, of something personal breaking through the surface of control, and he reached in slowly, his fingers brushing against the edge of the photograph before lifting it carefully, as if it weighed more than it should, and the room leaned closer without stepping forward, drawn by the gravity of a moment they did not understand. And Zariah watched him, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty. Because whatever was happening now was no longer about the safe. It was about him, about something he had hidden so deeply that even he had convinced himself it was just another locked system, just another layer of control, and his voice, when it came, was lower than before, almost restrained. You think this means something, he said, not quite a question, not quite a denial. And Zariah's eyes did not leave him as she answered. You built all of this to keep people out, she said softly, her voice steady. But you left one thing inside that you never meant to show anyone. And a faint murmur passed through the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to mark the shift, because this was no longer entertainment, no longer a game. This was something real, something uncomfortable, and Richard's grip on the photograph tightened just slightly before he exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the silence. And for the first time that night, he did not have an immediate response, did not have a line to bring the room back under his control, because control was no longer the center of the moment, truth was, and it had come from the one person no one had thought to listen to. And Zariah took a small step back, not retreating, but giving the moment space, her presence still steady, still grounded, and the room remained suspended between what had been said and what had yet to be understood, because whatever had just been uncovered was not finished revealing itself, and somewhere in that silence, the power in the room had shifted in a way no one could ignore anymore. Richard did not put the photograph down, even when the silence in the room began to stretch too long, his fingers holding it with a kind of care that did not match the man they thought they knew. The man who turned everything into numbers, into leverage, into games that always ended in his favor. And yet now he stood there looking at something that could not be measured, something that did not belong in a vault built for control. And the people around him felt it, the shift, the quiet discomfort of watching someone powerful hesitate, not because they were challenged, but because they were seen. And Zariah did not move closer, did not try to explain more than she already had. She simply watched, her presence steady, grounded, like she understood that this moment was not hers to take. It was his to face, and Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than before, as if it carried something older than the room, something he had not allowed himself to revisit. "You are making assumptions," he said finally, his voice regaining a layer of firmness. But it did not land the same way it had earlier. It did not command the room back into place. It only filled the silence temporarily, and Zariah's response came just as calm, just as measured. "Then why keep it locked away?" she asked, not accusing, not pushing, just asking. And that question did something the earlier ones had not. It stayed in the air, unanswered, because it was not about the system, not about the code. It was about intention. And intention could not be explained with technical terms, and Richard's gaze dropped back to the photograph, his thumb brushing lightly against the edge as if tracing a memory he had not intended to revisit. And for a brief moment, the room disappeared for him, the polished floors, the quiet observers, the expectations, all of it faded behind something far more personal, something tied to the image he held. And when he spoke again, it was quieter, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "Some things are not meant to be seen," he said, and Zariah's eyes softened just slightly, not with pity, but with understanding, because she knew what it meant to carry something like that, to hold on to something that shaped you in ways no one else could see. And she took a small step forward, not to challenge him, but to meet him where he stood. "Or maybe they are," she said gently, and the simplicity of that answer landed deeper than anything louder could have. Because it did not demand anything from him. It only offered a possibility, and the room, still watching, felt the tension shift again, not into confrontation, but into something quieter, something more fragile. And Richard looked up at her then, really looked, not at her uniform, not at her place in the room, but at her, and whatever he saw there was enough to hold his attention, enough to keep him from dismissing her words the way he might have before. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them no longer empty, but full, filled with something unspoken that did not need explanation. And then slowly, deliberately, Richard placed the photograph back inside the safe, his movements careful, almost respectful, before stepping back, leaving the door open, leaving the moment unfinished. And Zariah did not reach for it, did not close it. She simply stood there, her presence still calm, still grounded, as the room remained suspended in that quiet realization that whatever had just happened was not over. It had only just begun. The safe remained open, the photograph resting inside like it had always been meant to be seen, even if no one had ever been supposed to find it. And the air in the room felt different now, heavier, quieter, as if the walls themselves were holding on to what had just happened. And Zariah stepped back fully this time, not retreating but returning to where she had started, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, as if she had simply finished a task, not shifted the center of the entire room. And for a moment no one spoke, no one laughed, No one tried to reclaim the energy that had filled the space earlier, because it no longer fit, it no longer belonged, and Richard stood there, just a few feet from the open safe, his posture still composed but no longer effortless, the kind of stillness that comes when someone is recalibrating something internal, something deeper than strategy, and one of the guests cleared his throat. Softly, the sound almost out of place. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, trying to bring back some version of normal. But the words fell flat, because nothing about the moment felt normal anymore, and Richard did not respond to him, did not even acknowledge the attempt, his attention still anchored somewhere between the safe and the woman who had opened it. And when he finally turned, it was not with the same authority he had carried before, but with something more deliberate, more aware. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice steady, but quieter than the room remembered it being, and Zariah met his gaze without hesitation. "Zariah Cole," she answered, her tone simple, unguarded, and something about hearing her name seemed to settle into the space, grounding it, making her presence undeniable in a way it had not been before, and Richard nodded once, slow, thoughtful, as if committing it to memory, not out of politeness, but because it mattered now, in a way he had not anticipated, and he glanced back at the open safe, then at the photograph inside, then back at her, and the pause that followed carried weight, not confusion, but consideration. "You said it was not changing as much as I thought," he said, almost revisiting the moment, and Zariah gave a slight nod. "It adapts, but it starts from the same place every time," she replied, and he absorbed that, not just as information, but as something more, something that extended beyond the machine itself, and, for a second, the room seemed to fade again, not entirely, but enough that the exchange between them felt separate, quieter, more focused, and then Richard stepped back from the safe completely, leaving it open behind him, a silent admission that whatever had been hidden there was no longer meant to be concealed in the same way, and he looked around the room, taking in the faces that had once followed his lead without question, and there was a shift there too, subtle but real, curiosity replacing certainty, respect replacing dismissal, and when his gaze returned to Zariah, it held something new, not just interest, but recognition, the kind that does not come easily, especially from someone like him. "You should not be doing this kind of work," he said, gesturing lightly toward the cloth she had set down earlier, and the words could have sounded like judgment in another moment, but now they landed differently, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement, and Zariah did not react immediately, did not rush to accept or reject what he implied. She simply held his gaze for a second longer before answering, her voice calm, grounded. "Sometimes you do what you need to do until something else opens," she said, and the choice of words did not go unnoticed, not by him, not by anyone listening, and Richard's expression shifted again, just slightly, as if he understood more than she had said, as if the moment had revealed more than just a flaw in a system, and the open safe behind him remained untouched, its contents no longer the center of attention, because something far more significant had already been uncovered, something that could not be locked away again as easily. The room did not return to its earlier rhythm. It lingered in that suspended state where something important had already happened, but no one knew what came next, and Zariah felt it too. The shift in how the air carried attention, no longer brushing past her, but settling on her, staying there, and she did not lean into it, did not change her posture or her tone. She simply stood as she had before, grounded, steady, while the soft hum of the building filled the spaces between breaths, and Richard took another step, not toward the safe this time, but toward her, closing a distance that had not just been physical, his movements slower, more intentional, as if he was choosing each one instead of letting habit decide for him. And the people around them watched closely now, not out of curiosity alone, but because something about this exchange felt different, like the outcome mattered beyond the room, beyond the moment, and Richard stopped just a few feet away, close enough that his voice no longer needed to carry. "Where did you learn to see things like that?" he asked, not with disbelief, but with genuine interest. And Zariah considered the question for a second, not searching for an answer, but choosing how much to give, her eyes steady as she replied. "I learned to pay attention when no one else did." And the simplicity of it landed deeper than anything more complicated could have, because it was not framed as talent, not as something extraordinary, just something necessary, something built over time in places where being overlooked was not a choice but a condition, and Richard absorbed that quietly, his expression shifting in small, almost imperceptible ways, as if he was recalculating something he had always taken for granted. And behind them, someone set a glass down a little too carefully, the faint sound echoing in the silence, reminding everyone that they were still there, still witnessing, but no longer part of the center of the moment. And Richard glanced briefly toward the open safe, then back at Zariah. "You saw more than the system," he said, not a question, but a realization, and she gave a slight nod, her voice calm. "Systems come from people," she replied, and that thought settled between them, quiet but undeniable, because it reframed everything, not just the safe, but the man who had built it. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer tense, but reflective, as if both were standing at the edge of something that had not yet been fully understood. And then Richard exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signals a decision forming, even if it has not been spoken yet. "Most people in this room tried to impress me tonight," he said, his voice steady, but softer than before. "You did not." And there was no arrogance in the statement, no performance, just a simple acknowledgement. And Zariah did not respond immediately, because she did not need to, the truth of it already sitting in the space between them. And after a brief pause, she spoke, her tone unchanged. "I was not trying to." And something about that answer, its honesty, its lack of strategy, shifted the moment again, making it clear that whatever came next would not follow the same rules as before. And Richard nodded once, almost to himself, as if confirming something he had just realized. And when he looked at her again, there was no trace of the earlier amusement, no trace of dismissal, only focus, clear and direct. And in that quiet exchange, without announcement or spectacle, the balance of power in the room had already begun to change in a way that could not be undone. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted in layers, like a room slowly remembering how to breathe. But no one returned to what they had been doing before, because whatever had just unfolded had changed the way they were looking at everything. And Zariah felt it in the way people no longer looked past her, in the way their attention held, cautious now, almost careful, as if they were unsure what else she might reveal if they underestimated her again. And Richard remained where he stood, his posture steady but no longer distant, his focus anchored in a way that suggested he was not finished with the moment, not yet. And he glanced once more toward the open safe, the photograph still visible inside, before turning back to her, his voice quieter, more deliberate. "You saw something in that system that no one else did," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as a statement he was still processing. And Zariah did not shift under it, did not take it as recognition or approval. She simply answered, "I saw what was already there." And that answer settled into him differently, because it removed the idea of exception, of rarity, and replaced it with something more unsettling, the idea that others could have seen it too, if they had looked, if they had listened. And that thought lingered, pressing against assumptions he had carried for years. And a man near the edge of the room finally stepped forward, his voice tentative. "So the safe is not secure," he said, trying to reframe the moment into something technical, something measurable. But Richard did not look at him, did not engage with the question, because that was not what mattered anymore, not in the way it had before. And Zariah answered instead, her tone calm, grounded. "It is secure," she said, "but it is built by a person, and people leave traces." And that answer closed the gap the man had tried to open, not dismissing the system, but redefining it. And the room absorbed that quietly, because it was no longer about weakness or flaw, it was about understanding. And Richard let out a slow breath, the kind that carries realization with it, not sudden, but steady, as if something had been aligning inside him piece by piece. And he took a step back, giving the space between them room to exist without pressure. And for a moment, his gaze moved across the room, taking in the people who had laughed earlier, who had followed his lead without question. And there was a difference there now, subtle but real, the certainty replaced with something more reflective. And when he looked back at Zariah, his voice had shifted again, quieter, but more grounded than before. "Most people try to prove something when they are given a chance like that," he said, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple. I was not trying to prove anything. And that honesty held, because it did not reach for approval, did not seek validation. It just existed, steady and clear, and something in that steadiness anchored the moment again, not in tension, but in clarity, and Richard nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, and the open safe behind him remained untouched, its presence no longer central, because what it had revealed had already moved beyond it, and the room, still watching, understood something without needing it explained, that whatever had shifted between them was not temporary. It was the beginning of something neither side had expected, something that would not return to what it was before, no matter how quiet the moment seemed now. The room did not return to noise, not yet, because something unspoken held it in place, like everyone was waiting for a direction that no longer felt obvious, and Zariah could feel that weight without turning to look, the awareness that every movement now carried meaning it did not have before, and she did not step forward or back. She simply stood where she was, steady, grounded, while the open safe behind Richard remained like a quiet witness to everything that had shifted, and Richard himself did not speak immediately, his gaze drifting once more to the photograph inside, then back to her, as if the connection between the two had not fully resolved in his mind. And when he finally moved, it was not toward the crowd, not toward the safe, but slightly to the side, creating space between himself and the expectations that had once surrounded him, his voice lower now, more measured than before. Do you know why I built it that way? He asked, not as a test, but as something closer to an admission waiting to happen, and Zariah did not rush to answer, did not fill the space too quickly. She allowed the question to exist. For a moment before responding, her tone calm, thoughtful. Because you wanted control, she said, then after a brief pause added, but not over everything. And that second part lingered, subtle but precise, and something in Richard's expression shifted again, not surprise, but recognition, as if she had reached a conclusion he had not spoken out loud in years, and a quiet breath left him, slower this time, carrying something that sounded almost like relief, though he did not name it, and the people in the room felt it too, even if they could not explain it. The way the tension was no longer sharp but reflective, like watching something personal unfold in a space that had not been built for it. And one woman near the back glanced toward another, her expression uncertain, as if unsure whether to stay or leave, but no one moved, because leaving would mean missing whatever came next, and Zariah shifted her weight slightly, not uncomfortable, just present, her eyes still steady on him, not pushing, not retreating, and Richard nodded once, almost to himself. Most people think control means keeping things locked away, he said slowly, as if shaping the thought while speaking it. But sometimes it means deciding what you are willing to face. And the words did not sound like something he had planned to say. They sounded like something he had only just realized, and the room absorbed that quietly, because it did not fit the version of him they knew, the version that calculated everything, that stayed ahead of every outcome. And Zariah listened without interrupting, her presence still calm, still grounded. And when she spoke again, her voice carried no challenge, only clarity. Then why hide it? She asked softly, and that question did not land as pressure. It landed as an opening, and Richard's gaze returned to the photograph again, his posture still but no longer guarded. And for a moment, it seemed like he might not answer, like the silence might stretch long enough to close the moment. But instead he stepped forward, just enough to stand beside the safe again, not reaching inside, not closing it, just standing there with it open, and the distance between what he had built and what it held felt smaller now, more visible, and the room watched without speaking, because whatever he said next would not just answer her question, it would define something far deeper than the system he had created. And in that quiet, suspended moment, the night had shifted completely, no longer about power or spectacle, but about something far more difficult to control. Richard did not answer right away, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken before, not because he had nothing to say, but because whatever answer he gave would no longer be protected by distance or control, and he knew it. And for the first time that night, the man who had built systems to anticipate every outcome stood in a moment that could not be engineered, could not be redirected. And the open safe beside him seemed less like an object now and more like a question that had already been asked, and Zariah did not move, did not push him further. She simply waited, her presence steady, giving him the space to either step into the truth or retreat back into the version of himself the room expected, and the people around them remained still, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that something real was unfolding, something that did not belong to spectacle or status. And Richard finally exhaled, slow and controlled, his gaze dropping briefly to the photograph before lifting again, not to the crowd, but to her. "Because if it stays locked," he said, his voice lower now, almost measured against something internal, "then it stays contained." And the words were simple, but they carried weight, not as explanation, but as admission, and Zariah's eyes did not leave his as she listened, because she understood what he was saying beneath what he chose to say, and the room felt it too, the shift from performance to truth. And he continued, quieter now, "There are things that do not fit into success, or control, or any of the things people expect from me." And that sentence did not sound like something he had practiced. It sounded like something he had avoided, something he had kept behind systems and distance for years, and a faint movement passed through the room, not interruption, just the subtle reaction of people witnessing something they were not used to seeing. And Zariah took a small step closer, not invading the space, just enough to meet him in it, her voice calm, steady. "So you built something to hold it," she said, and he nodded once, almost imperceptibly, because that was exactly what he had done, not just with the safe, but with everything. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, but grounded, filled with understanding that did not need to be explained. And then Richard glanced toward the crowd, just briefly, as if remembering where he was, before looking back at her. And there was a difference now, not just in tone, but in presence, something less guarded, less constructed. "You opened it," he said, not as a challenge, not as a question, just as a fact that had shifted something he could not undo. And Zariah did not respond immediately, because she knew this was not about the mechanism anymore. And when she did speak, her voice carried the same calm certainty it had from the beginning. "It was never fully closed," she said, and that answer landed deeper than anything else had, because it reframed the entire moment, not as something she had broken through, but as something he had left unfinished, something he had not fully sealed away. And Richard absorbed that slowly, his expression still, but changed, as if he was seeing his own actions from a distance for the first time. And behind him, the safe remained open, the photograph untouched, no longer hidden, no longer protected in the same way. And the room stayed quiet, because whatever had just been revealed was not just about a safe. It was about a man who had built his life on control, now standing in a moment where control no longer defined the outcome. And in that stillness, something deeper than power had begun to take its place. The words lingered in the air long after she said them, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and Richard stood there absorbing them in a way that no one in the room had ever seen him do before, not deflecting, not reframing, just standing with them. And the open safe behind him no longer felt like a symbol of control, but something else entirely, something unfinished, something that had been waiting longer than he had admitted. And Zariah did not step forward again. She held her ground, not claiming the moment, not pushing it further, just allowing it to settle where it needed to, because she understood that what came next had to come from him, not from her. And the room, still silent, seemed to understand that too, every eye fixed but no one daring to interrupt, because whatever was happening now was no longer part of the evening. It had moved beyond it, and Richard finally shifted, not away from the moment, but deeper into it, his hand lifting slightly, as if he might reach for the safe again, then stopping halfway, his fingers hovering in the air before lowering again, a small motion, but one that revealed hesitation, something unfamiliar for a man who had built his reputation on certainty. And when he spoke, his voice carried that difference, quieter, more deliberate. "You are right," he said, the words simple, but heavier than anything he had said all night. And a faint ripple moved through the room, not loud, just the subtle reaction of people hearing something they did not expect. And Zariah did not react outwardly, but her eyes remained steady on him, acknowledging without taking ownership. And Richard let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting once more toward the photograph, then back to her. It was never fully closed, he repeated, as if testing the truth of it out loud. And something in his expression shifted again, not breaking, but opening, just slightly, enough to let something real come through, and he took a step back, creating space not out of distance, but clarity. And for a moment, he looked around the room, really looked, at the people who had watched him for years, who had measured success in numbers and control, who had laughed when he laughed and followed when he led. And there was something different in his gaze now, something more aware, as if he was seeing not just them, but himself reflected in them. And when his attention returned to Zariah, it held something new, not authority, not curiosity, but respect, quiet and unspoken. And he nodded once, not as a signal to the room, but to her. And that small gesture carried more weight than any announcement could have, and Zariah felt it, not as validation, but as recognition, the kind that does not need to be said out loud. And she gave a slight nod in return, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded. And the space between them settled into something steady, no longer defined by contrast, but by understanding. And behind them, the safe remained open, untouched, its contents no longer hidden, not because it had been forced open, but because it had finally been seen, and the room, still quiet, held on to that realization, because it was not just about what had been revealed, it was about what had been chosen, the decision not to close it again, not to return things to the way they had been. And in that stillness, the night had shifted completely, no longer about power or performance, but about something far more difficult to control, something that could not be locked away once it had been acknowledged. No one reached for the safe, not even Richard, and that absence of action spoke louder than anything else in the room, because for the first time, leaving something open was not a mistake, it was a choice, and Zariah understood that without needing it explained, her eyes resting briefly on the photograph before lifting again, not to claim the moment, but to acknowledge that it had already moved beyond her, and Richard stood beside it, no longer guarding it, no longer positioning himself between it and the world. His posture still composed but no longer defensive, and the shift in him was subtle, not something that could be pointed to in a single gesture, but something that carried through his presence, through the way he no longer filled the space with certainty, and instead allowed something quieter to exist, and the room felt it. The difference between control and clarity, between performance and truth, and for a moment, the silence held, not awkward, not empty, but complete, as if the night had reached a point it had not been designed to reach. And then Richard turned slightly, not away from the safe, but towards Zariah again, his expression steady, grounded in a way that had not been there before. "You could have said nothing," he said, his voice calm, without accusation, without expectation, just a statement of fact. And Zariah met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple. "I saw something that mattered." And the words did not carry weight because of how they were said, but because of what they refused to become. They were not self-congratulation, not explanation, just truth. And Richard nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had not fully understood until now. And he took a small step back, giving the space between them room to breathe, not distancing himself, but allowing the moment to settle into something stable. And behind him, the photograph remained visible, no longer hidden behind steel or code, and the people in the room, still watching, seemed to recognize that whatever had been revealed was not meant to be turned back into a spectacle. It was meant to remain exactly as it was, quiet and real. And one by one, their attention shifted, not away, but softer, less intrusive, as if they understood that the moment no longer belonged to them. And Zariah glanced down briefly at the cloth she had set aside earlier, then back up again, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet confidence she had carried from the beginning. And Richard followed her glance for a second before looking back at her. And there was something in his expression now that had not been there before, not curiosity, not calculation, but recognition of something that could not be measured or controlled. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that shift, steady and clear. "Not everything valuable is meant to be locked away," he said, and the words did not sound like a conclusion. They sounded like a realization still unfolding. And Zariah gave a slight nod, not agreeing, not confirming, just acknowledging that the truth of it had already been found, and the open safe behind them remained untouched, not because it had been forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be closed. And in that quiet, steady space, something had changed in a way that could not be undone, not by closing a door, not by returning to what had been before, because what had been seen could not be unseen, and what had been understood could not be ignored. And the night, once built around power and certainty, now rested in something far more fragile and far more real. The room did not erupt. It did not return to laughter or applause. It settled into something quieter, something that lingered long after the moment had passed. And Zariah knew it was time to move, not because she was dismissed, not because she had to leave, but because her part in it was complete. And she turned slightly, her hand reaching for the cloth she had set aside earlier, the same simple motion she had made countless times before. But this time it carried a different weight, not because the action had changed, but because the room had. And as she picked it up, the faint scent of lemon cleaner returned, grounding, familiar, a reminder of where she had started and everything that had led her here. And she did not rush, did not look back immediately. She simply took a step, then another, moving away from the safe, from the center of attention, from the space that had shifted around her. And for a second, it almost felt like the room might let her go unnoticed again, might return her to the background where she had begun. But that did not happen, because Richard spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly enough that it carried. "Zariah," he said, and she paused, just for a moment, before turning back, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and he stood there beside the open safe, no longer guarding it, no longer defined by it, and the distance between them felt different now, not measured by status or expectation, but by something quieter, something earned. And he held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if choosing his words carefully, as if understanding that whatever he said next would not be about the room, not about the audience, but about something far more personal. And then he spoke, his voice steady, without performance. "You did not just open that safe," he said, pausing briefly before continuing. "You showed me something I chose not to see." And the words did not echo. They settled, deep and quiet, because they were not meant to impress anyone. They were meant to be true. And Zariah listened without reacting outwardly, her eyes steady, her presence unchanged, because she did not need acknowledgement to validate what had already happened. And after a brief silence, she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as agreement, but as recognition that the moment had reached its end. And she turned again, this time continuing her walk without pause, moving toward the edge of the room, back into the space she had come from. But she was not invisible anymore, not to anyone who had witnessed what had just unfolded. And behind her, Richard remained where he stood, his gaze not following her steps, but resting briefly on the open safe, on the photograph inside. And for the first time, he did not feel the need to close it, did not feel the instinct to restore control or redefine the narrative. He simply let it remain as it was, open, visible, real. And the people around him did not speak, did not move to fill the silence, because they understood that whatever had happened was not something to be commented on. It was something to be remembered. And as Zariah reached the far side of the room, her reflection faint in the glass once more, the distance between who she was and how they had seen her before felt undeniable. And though she returned to the same quiet space she had started in, nothing about her presence felt the same. And in the stillness that followed, the room held on to one simple truth, not spoken, but understood, that power had not changed hands that night, it had changed meaning, and that was something no safe could ever contain.